Welcome to the Woman's Connection. I'm barrie-louise Switzen, your moderator. The Woman's Connection is a program about events shaping women's lives and helping one gain authentic power on a personal or professional level. So won't you stay tuned? Welcome to my show. I'm Barrie Switzen. The show is The Woman's Connection, and with me is Carleen Hutchins. We're going to learn how she turned a woodworking hobby into a career of building some beautiful instruments. Carleen, thank you so much for joining me and letting us come into your home today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's wonderful. Now, why don't you tell us what is hanging behind us here?
Well, that's a series of violas, 16-inch violas, which I have kept here for some years because each one of those has a different kind of wood in its back. That's an experiment. And I'm in this largely for the experimental purposes to try and find out what makes fine violins sound the way they do.
Now, how long have you been in this experimental area?
40 years.
40 years. And I say you found a few
I've found a few things that really help and that are helping violin makers all over the world.
That's wonderful. Can you just elaborate? What have you succeeded in discovering?
Well, it's a long story, but I started out working with Professor Saunders up at Harvard, by mail, more or less, trying to see if we could find out what changes could be made in instruments. He had never had a chance to cut into an instrument. And I offered to make some boxes that he could cut up, some rather inexpensive, not too well-made violas.
Now, how long ago was this?
That was in 1947, 48, 49. I learned to do the first viola out of a book and a blueprint and some help from a violin maker in New York.
Oh, that's great.
And they told me what to do and what not to do, and some of it wasn't very good, I found out later. But my first viola was rated the work of a good carpenter. And I made it simply because I wanted something that I could play that was better than the $75 viola that I was buying. It was a reasonably good viola, but it wasn't particularly good sounding, and I was trying to play with some very fine musicians. And they said, Carleen, in the first place, the reason I got the viola was that I used to play the trumpet in the high school band and orchestra. And the trumpet didn't suit playing in a New York apartment.
Not quite.
My friends said, Carleen, look, that trumpet is far too loud with strings, and we want to play quartets, and you better go get a viola. We need one. So I went and bought one.
Did you ever play a viola before?
No, I hadn't played a viola before. I just decided I was going to try to learn it. And I never got to be a very good viola player because you don't learn when you're 40 years old what happens.
So you were actually 40 years old when you took up a new instrument.
And a new career,
practically. And a new career. Wow. What did your husband or family say about it?
Well, my husband urged me on because he knew I loved to work in wood. And my family just went along with what I wanted to do. They always had.
But let's step back a bit. You weren't always doing this, and you never really got into it. I mean, that was not your first career choice?
I had no intention of getting into this whatsoever.
What did you really want to do?
Well, when I graduated from Cornell in 1933, I wanted to be a doctor. But there was no money.
Right.
I had a degree in biology. I had some teacher's training course, and I had enough to get myself accepted at one of our top medical schools. But there was no way to get into the medical school with no money. In the Depression, we didn't have any. Besides, my friends didn't think that was where ladies should be anyway.
But you still wanted to be a doctor.
I still wanted to be a doctor.
Are you sorry that you never became a doctor?
Not really, because I've seen a lot of people, a lot of gals struggling to be doctors, and I've struggled to do this, and I'm far happier doing this, I think, now than I would have been if I'd been a doctor.
So something that was a negative you turned into a positive.
Well, something's been pushing me. This is like a set of dominoes that's been pushing me to, first one goes down and the next one goes down, and it's kept going. for the last 40 years.
What do you feel is the greatest achievement?
Well, first of all, that I can make decent instruments.
Mm-hmm.
And I've worked hard to learn to do that, but I think my greatest achievement is to find methods which will help violin makers make better instruments based on the acoustics that I learned from Frederick Saunders. He had experimented with violins in the 1930s and had tested all sorts of fancy instruments. He tested Heifetz Guarnerius violin, and I never expected to make instruments that were equal in sound to those instruments, but now I think I can.
It almost sounds as if you've surpassed them.
Well, someday these are going to be better, but you can't build 200 years of playing into a modern instrument. That makes a lot of difference because, first of all, it's the player who makes the instrument sound well. The player imposes his own energy, his own feelings onto that instrument, and it changes the instrument.
What kind of challenges did you find that you had along the way?
The challenges?
Yes, as far as being a woman, doing this. Did you have people saying, oh, you're a woman, you can't do this?
Well, they've always told me I was in trouble, that I couldn't do very much of it. I would go to meetings and I would sit in a corner and listen to these guys sounding off, and pretty soon I'd have a paper that made them sit up and take notice.
So
I've never been fussing at them. I've never considered myself a feminist or someone who was going to push the feminine side of it. I just figured I would do a good job.
And you've been recognized around the world.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And how many papers have you had published?
Well, over 100. I've kept a series of papers coming on the findings as I've gone along, because otherwise you forget what you've done.
And you don't want to repeat it.
No, and I've got records all over the house of things that I have done that I've published in different journals, but largely in our Catgut Acoustical Society journal.
Now let's start with the catgut. How did you get the name, and what exactly is it?
Well, 4 of us who were working with Professor Saunders in acoustics during the 1950s decided that just for fun we'd call ourselves the Catgut Acoustical Society. It was a joke.
Well, what does catgut stand for?
Well, catgut is what they used to make strings out of back in the 1500s. But we no longer use catgut for strings.
It was the 4 of you that started this Catgut Acoustical Society.
And in 1963, there was a meeting, I think it was in the Hotel New Yorker in New York, of the Acoustical Society of America. And I conned a few of the people that I was in great admiration of to come out here and join in a discussion. And 23 of us sat around my ping pong table out here under the apple tree and decided that we would call ourselves the Catgut Acoustical Society, and it was founded in 1963.
And it's been going since?
And it's kept going ever since. The 23 people have grown to over 800 in 36 countries now.
Don't you also have a website that you're on?
We're on the web, and we're on the Internet.
All right.
I got swamped on the Internet last week, and it pretty near broke down. It did break down.
What happened?
Well, got onto this Internet, which discusses among a group of violin makers, and that goes all over the world. There's several, I guess there are maybe 100 or so, more than that, on this one particular Internet sort of, I don't know how you'd describe it. I got under that a few weeks back, and the first week I got 110 of these things. The second week I got 150, and the next week 175, and then the computer broke down.
Sounds like it's keeping you busy just on the Internet.
Well, it is, but I don't have to answer them all. I just look at the ones that are interesting and talk to some of these guys out there in the blue, people that I've known and worked with, some that I don't know, and it's been lots of fun.
Well, what is your website if somebody wanted to go into your site?
The website is Catgut Acoustical Society.
For Foster Saunders. You brought him the boxes that he could disassemble.
Well, first he saw my first viola, and he tapped around on it, and he blew in the F-holes, and he said, "Young lady, I'd like to see your next one." And I had never, at that point, I hadn't intended to make a next one. I just wanted to make one that I could play.
Right.
That was better than what I could buy, you see. And then I read his reprints and realized that he hadn't had a chance to cut up anything. He hadn't had a chance to do anything. Well, with Heifetz Guarnerius, you don't start cutting into the wood, let's say.
Okay.
And I made him some experimental instruments. I call them boxes, but they were good-sounding instruments, and they were well-made as far as I could do it without putting all the fancy varnish and the trimmings on that you need to make on a finished instrument. And I made about 6 of those for him.
Was he surprised?
In the course of 15 years, well, he didn't really think it was going to help very much, but in the course of 15 years, we did maybe 1,000 experiments. Some of them went to pieces. We did so much. We've got one that's still left intact, and it's flat top, flat back, and it looks awful, but it has a good sound.
Well, that's all that counts.
Not all that counts in the music world.
Oh, okay. Let me ask you something. You were saying about the F holes. Is
Yes.
this what you're talking about
Those
with
are
the
F
Fs?
holes. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what's the significance of these?
Well, in the first place, they give the air volume a chance to function inside the box.
Okay.
They give flexibility to the bridge, which rocks on the top. If you didn't have these cuts, you'd have a pretty stiff thing. And then the air they don't just let the sound out of the box. They have a great many functions that are pretty important in the way a violin works. But they call them F holes because it's the shape of the old-fashioned F.
Look.
And it gives you exactly the right distance across here and spacing this way for the bridge to work on.
Okay, now what instrument is this?
That's a little tiny treble. It's not a child's instrument. It looks like the child's size. In fact, it is a child's size, but this is tuned an octave above the violin, and it belongs in our new violin family, which we've developed over the years.
The octet?
The octet.
The octet. Want to tell us about that?
Well, that's the other thing that I think is probably more important than anything else I've ever done. In the long run, I think these instruments will be adopted into the mainstream of contemporary music. But for the last 30 years, I've been working on a proposal that Henry Brandt, the composer-conductor, came in here back in 1957, and he asked me for the sound of the violin projected into 7 other tone ranges. He didn't want the sound of the viola or the cello or the bass. There's a husky blending quality to those instruments rather than the clarity of the violin sound itself. And I'd been doing enough experimenting with Dr. Saunders so that within half an hour I agreed to try to do what Henry Brandt wanted, and it took me 10 years.
Well, that's not too bad.
Well, and it's worked. But we've also discovered, without realizing it, that these instruments are something that had been envisioned back in the 1500s. Michael Pretorius has a book which publishes a listing of Geigen, which is German for violin, in 7 tone ranges, which are practically similar and in sizes very close to what we've done. And over the years, apparently, there have been trials of this kind of thing. In France, there were several. There was a man in our country here, Frederick Dautric, who tried to do it in the 1920s, but they didn't have the benefit of acoustics. He even had his instruments played for Toscanini at Carnegie Hall.
Now, did you do research into taking their findings and adapt them?
We didn't even know they existed when we started.
How did you find out that they existed?
Someone told me after we got these things all made that there was something else that had been done before. We didn't know a thing about this. What we did was to go to the violin itself and look through many tests that Saunders had done and other people who worked on violin acoustics in Germany particularly. Hermann Meinl did a lot of wonderful work over there years back. And we took the findings that they had, which gave us the difference between a violin acoustics and acoustics of the other instruments. And it came right down to simply putting the 2 biggest resonances on the 2 open middle strings.
And that's how you vary the sound?
And we varied the sound. We varied the size of these instruments to achieve just that.
That's
the length of the body, the depth of the body, and making them playable.
And you've had many concerts throughout the world?
We've had concerts. We have a set that has been played very much recently in St. Petersburg, Russia, where they've done a beautiful job with the instruments. I've taken them to maybe over 200 lectures all over this country, all over England and Scandinavia.
You also have one of your, I think it's a violin or a viola, in the Metropolitan Museum in New York?
Well, it's a full set.
It's a full set.
It's a whole set. We actually gave the Metropolitan Museum of Art a full set of these octet instruments.
So anybody can go and view them? Whatever.
Well, they're not on exhibit because we're having problems with people who don't think that they would like to have them around. Let's put it that way.
Oh.
The conventional violin makers hate me for a variety of reasons. First of all, I'm putting numbers on the mystique that they have in terms of tuning plates, free plates of instruments before they're finished, and learning how to do it. I'm fixing it so people who are not as well trained as they can make fine violins.
But then you're actually putting these people out of work.
Well, I'm not putting them out of work, but I'm adding a dimension which they don't like. And I'm putting numbers on their mystique, shall we say.
Right.
And they say science is nothing but charts and things on the blackboard, but that's another story. They can forget that. Because a lot of this has been intuition.
Mm-hmm.
The next jump has come sometimes when I'm asleep, or the biggest one came when I was mad at somebody.
Oh?
I was good and mad one day, and I went off in a corner and sat by myself for a while, and all of a sudden, a whole pile of things just flew together. And I got some answers I'd been looking for quite a while.
Boy, you let your mind rest.
You just let your mind run, and all of a sudden it'll do the job for you, which is incredible. I don't know where it comes from, but that's what happens.
That's some of your biggest discoveries.
So, but then I think the thing that may go further than anything else, except this business of making and fixing instruments so that they can be brought to optimum condition acoustically, is this octet, the group for these instruments in the octet, because the sound of those instruments is out of this world exciting.
Right.
Even the Yo-Yo Ma played the Bartok concerto on our alto, which is tuned like a viola, but it's big enough so that it's played on a pin.
We're going to have to look at some of your techniques and show the audience.
Well, I can show you some of that. It's fun because you can take an instrument and you can tap and listen and blow in the F-holes and hum in the F-holes.
Right.
And a person can really, if they know what they're doing, they can really understand what's happening to some of these resonances.
You have to have a good ear for this whole...
You need to learn to listen. It isn't necessarily a good ear for music, essentially, but you've got to learn to listen to complicated sounds and try to identify them. And that takes practice.
Stay with us as we make our way down to Carleen Hutchins' laboratory, where this violin maker and research extraordinaire explains what she does with all this equipment, giving us a demonstration or two on some of the techniques she uses in testing and developing her violins.
You know, what are you doing here, Carleen?
I'm getting ready to test this plate.
Okay. Now that's like the front of the violin.
This is the back.
That's the back.
Mm-hmm.
Because it doesn't have the Fs.
That's right. It doesn't have the Fs. What I'm going to do here is put it over a loudspeaker.
Right.
And send a sine wave through it. That's a single frequency wave, like a siren that goes through the thing. And when it reaches the point at which this piece of wood has its own natural vibrations, we'll get a pattern on here, because what I want to do is sprinkle some Christmas glitter. This is colored black.
Uh-huh.
And I'll sprinkle this on. I could use salt. I did use salt for a while, but salt isn't good for electronics. And you need something flat that won't roll on these on these arch plates. So I'm going to turn it on and run through the frequency of it.
Now you just vibrated this, is that the right word?
Yes, the loudspeaker underneath
Right.
vibrated this until I changed the frequency on it until it came to the place in the spectrum at 125 vibrations a second. We call it 125 hertz. And this pattern develops when the wood is actually vibrating in its own natural mode of vibration. And this is one of them. These photographs here on the wall were done with laser light of a series. These are all the same piece of wood, and these are the different patterns that you can get in a single piece of wood.
Now this is the top.
Well, the back is actually called curly maple.
All right.
It's a curly effect in the wood, which we think is a genetic characteristic, because the trees that we find this stuff in are usually in a group someplace in the forest. And then in the top, it's straight grain spruce. And this is carved, the archings are carved, the same as the back. And then we cut what we call the F-holes in there, and that's done with a knife. And then we have the same thing here, except on the inside of the top, there's what we call a base bar. And this is very critical. The guy way back in the early days of violin making or instruments who moved this bar from the center where it was in a lot of the early type of instruments. The Welsh Kruth has it in the middle still. Some of the viols have it in the middle. But the off-center bass bar and a post that's inside of the instrument fix it so that you have the effect of a rocking lever with the bass bar transmitting the sound to the whole part of the instrument. Without that, we wouldn't have violins. I very carefully mount this on foam pads, soft urethane foam usually, whatever comes, because I put them at the places where I know that the vibration is not going to be. In other words, we call them nodes, the places of no vibration, and I put them on the pads at these 4 places. They're underneath here, because if I mount them on the places that are active, then it spoils the activity.
I hear you. Okay, so we're going to get the high frequency. What frequency are you going to go at?
And I'll sprinkle the glitter on this and do the same test that I showed you on the other one.
Wow, you can feel the difference. Carleen, what is this? What are we looking at here?
Well, I've got a violin hanging on 5 rubber bands, because in order to test an instrument like this, it's so sensitive that if you touch it with a clamp or anything solid, you're going to change the vibrations in that instrument. Even the player makes a difference. But what I can do here is, if I want to find out what the air inside is doing, I've got a little tiny loudspeaker, which is made for ear canal research.
Oh, really?
And I'm good friends with the guy who makes these, so I can get them because they're pretty expensive. And what I do is set it so that I can put this in one side.
Right.
And then over here I've got a tiny little microphone that I can put in the other side.
I love your testing way up here.
Well, this is the kind of work you have to do. I mean, it looks messy, but it works. I had a famous physicist in here one time, and he said, well, this looks like a physicist. Which pleased me. And that goes in that side, and I can send a signal Barry's working with right now, and have it go through into the instrument, and then come back to this, which is a recorder.
Almost looks like a polygraph.
This thing works. And this sends out a chart, which will print what I want to find out from that instrument over there.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives me some information, because what I do is I test the wood, and then I test the inside air, and I relate the two, because the combination of wood and air vibrations is what makes the violin sound.
Beautiful. Now, what have you got over here? Carleen, you want to tell us a little bit about the boxes that you've got here? They're all different. They're numbered, they're labeled.
These are all normal violins that I want to do an experiment with. And I've tried experiments with these instruments over the last 40 years, and unless I can find out something in 10 instruments that works, I can't be sure. Those are violins that I have ready for testing that I keep down here. Whereas this whole area is air-conditioned and temperature-controlled, because you can't test wood with the temperature and humidity bouncing around.
I can imagine. How long does it take to make an instrument? Does it?
Well, I figured it takes about 200 hours to make the wood part
of
a small instrument like this. The bigger ones take even more. Yes, they sound good even when you hang them.
I don't want to break them. That's what I'm thinking about.
Just don't drop them on this cement floor. It's a little.
Oh, all right. No. How many violins and instruments have you made through the years?
Let's see, I've made 162 violas, which is my specialty. I've decided I wanted to make those because I figured the viola needed more attention acoustically than the other instruments. And I think I can make some pretty good violas, perhaps better than most anybody else has ever made.
And you're in demand.
The players are after them, which is exciting. I've made probably 60 violins. A lot of instruments I've done experimentally, and I wouldn't call them any one thing or another. About 10, 12 cellos, and 100 instruments of the octet, the new ones of the octet, all the way from the big bass to the little tiny one that I showed you.
The miniature one, as I call it. That is terrific. Well, Carleen, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the show. It's been wonderful having you.
Thank you for listening to me.
Oh, it's been terrific. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our audience has too. And we're going to have to come back sometime and hear a concert and tape that.
Well, that would be fun too, because
the Russian.
That's where the answer is. It's in the sound.
Well, it's beautiful. Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you again.